Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. Today we're talking about a topic that Alex and I both enjoy, so I'm going to leave it to her to introduce our guest.
So excited. One of the chief curators for Historic Royal Palaces, chief executive of the Heritage Education Trust, author of books and novels galore, including Henry VIII and The Men Who Made Him, and more importantly today, the definitive biography of Thomas Cromwell. It's Tracy Borman. Hello, Tracy.
Hello, it's lovely to be with you.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be talking about the real Thomas Cromwell and Hilary Mantel's trilogy, Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies and The Mirror and the Light. We're going to look at what's historically accurate, what isn't, what the books have done for historians, and talk about some of the things we especially like or don't like. But first of all, how are you? How is lockdown?
Well, I'm very well. Do you know what? Today is one of my better days because I thought, I am going to have to get fit because I've basically just been sitting inside for a long time. So I started the day with a bike ride to Hampton Court, which was amazing. And
I saw on Twitter the photos.
I'm so lucky because it's only 5 miles from my house and it's a lovely ride. And I don't know why I haven't done it before, but I just got this yearning to be back at the palace because, I'm guilty of taking it for granted, working there, but it was just so heartwarming to see it. And physically, it did me really a lot of good as well. And there's such a link, isn't there, to mental well-being if you actually just get out and do some physical exercise.
Just go and look at something beautiful.
Absolutely. And it set up a treat.
We were talking before we started recording about the perils of looking after one's parents in this situation, and Alina is ferrying food backwards and forwards for hers, and I was saying that actually I think the biggest thing that's getting on my nerves about coronavirus now is Piers Morgan, because essentially I can't stop my mum watching his silly face every morning on Good Morning Britain and getting upset about all the waffle that comes out of him, but that's what he's there for, isn't it? He's there to provoke controversy and be scandalous.
Yeah. Sadly, yes. Your mum needs to get more into history, I think. Take refuge in history, if in doubt.
There is a fantastic new podcast she could be listening to, but she doesn't. She watches Piers Morgan instead. It's a bone of contention.
Your mum needs to take a leaf out of my parents' book, because my parents have been listening to this religiously, obviously, except for when my dad was really ill. But yeah, take a leaf.
Yeah, I would say, listen, Mum, but she's not listening. She's not listening. She's watching John Wayne films and Piers Morgan. Anyway, enough about my mum. Shame on you, Mum.
Do you know what? I think we should kick in with quite a bit of a stonker question.
Yeah.
Let's do it. So, what has the Wolf Hall trilogy given us as historians?
Well, I think it's given us a huge amount because there's a lot of snobbery out there among historians about historical fiction. I have to say it's not a snobbery I share because I absolutely love historical fiction, but it's seen as quite damaging sometimes because it gives false impressions of what really happened. But I've always said if it's well researched, it gets people into history. It's a good thing. And that's absolutely the case, of course, with Hilary Mantel's trilogy. And what I think that's particularly given, as well as kind of recruiting a whole army of Cromwell fans from people who probably hadn't heard of him, what that's given us is a reappraisal, because it's inspired historians to re-look at Cromwell, and I count myself among them. It was because of reading Wolf Hall that I was actually inspired to find out the real Cromwell and embarked upon my biography. So thank goodness for Hilary Mantel, I say.
Yeah, and she certainly has made everybody sort of sit up and take notice of a historical character, very significant historical character in terms of especially church history in England, that we hadn't really been paying attention to. From a literary perspective, putting aside your historian hat, what do you really like about the trilogy personally?
Well, I think it really evokes the time. I particularly like in the third book, this comes across very strongly, the humour. And you don't necessarily expect that, particularly for the third and final instalment, which is basically Cromwell's downfall. Spoiler alert.
If you didn't know that was coming, we can't help you. Yeah.
He's actually very, very funny. She's got an amazing turn of phrase, and I think that's very true to Cromwell himself, who was renowned for his irreverent humour. He even made his enemies laugh. They couldn't help it. So I think that's one of the things that appealed most to me. I can't claim that I got into Wolf Hall easily from the very beginning. A friend recommended it to me. It seems an awfully long time ago now. And I really struggled to get into it. But once I did, I was just hooked, and I found the second two actually an easier read, I think.
Yeah. I mean, we'll come back to that later, because I absolutely agree. My favourite, I love the artful decline of Norris, Weston, Brereton and George Boleyn, how she did that. Smeaton less so, because he obviously there were. So what happens, if you haven't read Bring Up the Bodies, is Cromwell has seen this mockery of Thomas Wolsey, his old master, carried out by these four men. And essentially what they do is carry an actor playing him to hell. And each one has a limb as they're doing this. And then one by one in Bring Up the Bodies, he takes down left front paw, right front paw, left hind leg. He does it like that, and he's ticking them off a list, and that's how she interpreted their decline. Smeaton less so, because I think she just said, well, he's kind of annoyed Cromwell and he's a bit irritating and bitchy. But the allegorical tie-in with the performance, that I thought that was really artistic.
I absolutely agree. It's so clever, and actually it's such a good theory. I mean, it's no coincidence that all those accused with Anne Boleyn were in some way, Mark Smeaton accepted perhaps, enemies of Cromwell and also enemies of Wolsey. So it was a kind of neat way for him to get rid of them, as well as bringing down the Queen.
And yeah, as I was reading it, and what it does is one by one he goes to interview them in the Tower and basically nail them for these accusations, which we'll move on to in a bit. But then all of a sudden at the end of the paragraph, it just says, so he sort of says farewell to each one of them as he leaves, having completely railroaded them, and it just says left front paw, and you're like, yes, like that as you're going through.
So if we're going to reverse this completely, as Thomas Cromwell's biographer, what really annoys you?
Okay, so Cromwell is made a bit too whiter than white by Hilary Mantel. Of course, if you're a novelist, you need a good hero. That's what he is. But he wasn't quite as one-dimensional as that. I think Hilary Mantel takes away some of the ruthlessness that he really did have. Now, he was operating in a ruthless world, absolutely fair enough, but he could be a pretty nasty piece of work when he needed to, and particularly with regard to bringing Anne Boleyn down, which he's sort of handled quite subtly in Wolf Hall. You're left with questions as to how much is this Cromwell's doing, how much is it Henry VIII's. In reality, I think the lion's share of the blame for Anne Boleyn's execution should go to Cromwell. Now, so much as I ended up really liking him and his character, I really couldn't forgive him that.
Yeah, that is one thing it comes across, that sort of Henry's prodded him in that direction, where my own interpretation of it has always been that Henry would have quite liked a new wife and had his eyes on Jane Seymour, and things were getting a bit tedious with Anne, and Cromwell just took it out of his hands and went, right, well, problem solved. That's how I see it. If anything I don't like about them, it's exactly what we've said already, is that Wolf Hall took a lot of getting into. I thought the style was tweaked slightly to make it much more readable. I just say it's tweaked, but it's not actually that subtle, because if you Bring Up the Bodies and just dive in with the decline of Anne Boleyn, it's so much easier to read. But you really should stick with Wolf Hall, shouldn't you? Because once you do get into it, you can't put it down.
Yeah, I could not agree more, because with Wolf Hall, I think the main criticism was that Hilary Mantel kept saying he and not saying who she meant by he, and you had to keep reading back, and it took me forever. I almost gave up. I got so frustrated. And that has definitely been amended for the next two books. And in the third one, it's the clearest yet, because constantly she's saying he, Cromwell, you know.
Yeah.
And so, exactly. So clearly she has responded to reader feedback.
Talk to us about Wolsey. How accurate is the relationship that's portrayed with him? Because it's almost devotion in the novels.
And I think that is pretty accurate, actually. A quality that we don't often see with Cromwell, or that hasn't traditionally been represented, is his loyalty. He was intensely loyal to those he loved, and there is no doubt that he loved his big patron, Thomas Wolsey, Cardinal Wolsey. And so I do think that's really well drawn by Hilary Mantel. It absolutely comes across. And there's only one recorded instance in the sources of Cromwell weeping. And he's found weeping when Wolsey falls from power, when it looks like his life is in danger. And before he kind of, gathers himself, Cromwell is actually found at this moment of weakness. And I think it does show just how much he was devoted to Wolsey, but his actions show that more.
So is that accurate as well? The manner in which in Wolf Hall he sticks by him for as long as possible.
Absolutely. He was pretty much the only one who did. Talk about rats and sinking ships. Everybody else, bar perhaps George Cavendish, Wolsey's faithful servant, they all deserted and went to serve Wolsey's enemies. But Cromwell was pretty much, the only one. And he didn't just kind of say he was loyal. He acted it. He tried desperately to get Henry to pardon Wolsey. I think thanks to Cromwell, Wolsey's life was saved, albeit not for long, because of course he died a natural death a year after his fall. But I think he would have died a much more violent death if it hadn't been for Cromwell's efforts.
And I want to know a bit more about Cromwell and his own views of religion, and how accurate is the portrayal in the book? So,
yeah, I think Cromwell was very much a genuine reformer. He believed in the reformist ideas that were coming in from the continent. He didn't just use them for his own political ends and to make the king a rich king by dissolving the monasteries. Of course, that was a useful benefit. But you can tell that Cromwell was real in his belief because he took huge risks for them. He had friends who would probably have got him into trouble, friends among the reformist circles, quite radical men. He kept books in his library at Austin Friars that would have had him hauled before the courts for heresy. And I think a really telling fact is that Cromwell actually paid out of his own pocket for the Bible to be translated into English, because he so believed the importance of getting God's word out to the ordinary people. So this is one of the things that I guess makes me the most cross when you see historians saying, oh, he's just cynical, using religion for his own political ends. It was so much more than that for Cromwell.
I have to stick with religion. I will tell anyone this that will listen, and I've said it twice on this podcast already. I've never, ever, ever been a fan of Thomas More. There's just too much about him that is grossly hypocritical and I suppose sanctimonious. So I didn't have a problem with the way Mantel chose to represent him, because he's almost a villain, and a mocked villain as well. It wasn't traditional at all, was it, this portrayal of him? And what's the truth so far as we can ascertain?
Well, good for you, because there aren't many people actually who have actually had the insight in the same way, because of course we're all beguiled by the likes of Man for All Seasons and what a great hero, how principled he was. But actually when researching Henry VIII and the men who made him, as well as Cromwell, the Cromwell biography, it really struck me. Actually, he kind of doesn't deserve that saintly reputation. No. He wasn't critical, and he fought blooming hard to get himself out of trouble. It's not just that he willingly became a martyr, as is often portrayed. He tried every trick in the book to get himself out of trouble. But the one thing he, of course, refused to do, and you have to admire him for this, he refused to take the oath of supremacy. But believe me, he tried literally everything else.
And he did some grim things to people as well, didn't he?
Absolutely. The torture of heretics being a particularly grim example. I mean, absolutely, he did not flinch from using sort of awful, horrible devices to wring confessions out of people, to try and make people stick to the true path as he saw it. He wasn't particularly nice to some members of his family. I don't think his treatment of his wife was all that.
Oh no, he's awful to her, and that's in the books as well, because I was like, yes, she's got that in there.
Yes, exactly. And so, there's a lot not to admire, I'm afraid, about Thomas More. Now, whether he deserves to be such a villain as he comes across in Wolf Hall, I don't know. I mean, it's a bit annoying to kind of say, well, it's probably a mix of the two. But I do think Hilary Mantel's Thomas More is closer to the truth.
Yeah, I think why I don't mind him being so awful in the book and hating him so much, is because there's been so much that's unbalanced the other way. I like to think that with doing that, she's just drawn us back somewhere towards the middle.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
And how she imagined Cromwell's childhood and early life.
That's right, because in fact we don't know very much at all. In fact, pretty much nothing of Cromwell's childhood. We know he was probably born in Putney, son of a blacksmith and general ne'er-do-well, Walter Cromwell. He was in trouble with the law so many times. So Mantel opens the trilogy with this brutal scene of Cromwell's father giving him a good beating. We don't know what their relationship was, but I think Mantel was right to infer that Walter Cromwell was a really kind of villainous character. So, you can forgive her for inferring that their relationship wasn't easy, but the fact is we don't know. We know he probably went travelling on the continent. He probably escaped home at an early age. He turns up in Florence, but that's according to an Italian novel who places him there. And so there's so much that's unknowable about Cromwell's early life because he was a nobody. He was born a nobody. So nobody is writing about him because he is merely the son of a blacksmith. So why would anybody write about him? So that's why we have to infer a lot. We go from the occasional reference that Cromwell later made to him being a ruffian in his youth, for example. But really, there's very little to go on.
I mean, the size of the first and the third books, you can knock someone out with them. They are hefty, and a large proportion of, especially Wolf Hall, does sort of reimagine his earlier life. And it talks about, there's just anecdotes that she chucks in there, sort of about his life when he was in the counting houses in Italy, and then when he was a soldier, and that she's obviously put a lot of thought into imagining an earlier life for Thomas Cromwell, and I think that that's really where she got to let her imagination run right. And it's almost as if she looked for ways, because obviously he was born a nobody, but I think she's used quite an admirable amount of imagination to think about how he got from being this absolute nobody to being qualified to do what he ends up doing. Do you agree?
I completely agree. And I think Hilary Mantel's genius actually is just picking up the occasional thread that we do have and weaving in this really rich tapestry as she does in her narrative. And she has, as you say, let her imagination go a little bit wild in the first book because there is little to go on. But what little there is, she uses. And I think she uses brilliantly. And she makes very educated guesses based on that evidence. I mean, this is a woman who has clearly lived and breathed Cromwell and his world for many, many years. I've met Hilary Mantel a couple of times, and on both occasions I was just struck by her dedication to her craft, both as a writer, but actually as a historian too.
I mean, we've waited a bloody long time for this third book. And it was originally due out in 2017, wasn't it? And she's not been shy in just saying, well, it took this long because it was hard. I mean, and as someone who's not an expert by any means with the original Tudor source material, my exposure to it's been very limited. I read them and I think she got that from there. She got that from there. I can see as sort of almost a layman, how in depth she's gone with the research and what she's been looking at, and the fact that she hasn't just sort of taken the easy way out. She has tried to make it, I think, as historically accurate as possible whilst crafting a novel, which I think she didn't have to do that. She could have just used a lot more poetic license.
I couldn't agree more. And there is a sort of scale of this among historical novelists. Some just take the very bare bones and then make all sorts of things up to suit their plot. Others, and I would count not just Hilary Mantel, but the likes of Alison Weir amongst this fraternity, or whatever the collective noun for novelists is, they are based much more closely on the available evidence. They're much more faithful to it. And I think their books are richer for it, because particularly with Cromwell, you couldn't make it up. There's plenty of drama in his life, and so you don't need to embellish that much to have great drama.
I do have to ask before we move on. I am not at the end of the mirror and the light yet, and I'm dreading it because I have grown to like him quite a lot. How graphic is it? Because obviously the axeman was supposedly drunk, right, and took a good 3 or 4 attempts to get his head off.
That's right. The theory is that the Duke of Norfolk, Cromwell's nemesis, really.
That's another scab in human history, isn't it?
Can't bear Norfolk.
I like the villainy of him.
Oh, I've tried to keep an open mind, but really, he's a nasty piece of work. But it's said that Norfolk had this final piece of revenge in store for Cromwell by either bribing the executioner or getting him drunk. And that's why it takes about 3 blows of the axe to finally sever Cromwell's head. Well, you know, I don't want to spoil it for anybody listening, but it is, you know, suffice it to say, it does paint quite a vivid picture, and it's so moving. You're absolutely with Cromwell, and perhaps you've been with him for all 3 books, but even just through this book you're really rooting for him. And I found myself even in the final few pages thinking, well, maybe he'll be saved, maybe
she changed the ending.
Yes, I can't. It's devastating. It is devastating. She does it so well.
Do you know what, that was something that they actually did quite well. There were elements of it that were utterly ridiculous, but it's another one of those things that brought Tudor history to life. People, the Tudors, that was horrific to watch the Cromwell execution in that. But also as well, do you know what else they nailed was the snivelling bastardry of Anne Boleyn's father as well, who I think is possibly worse than the Duke. They both sold her out, and they both used those girls to their utmost benefit for themselves and then ran away. But I think for me, Wiltshire just about tips the balance over Norfolk, because he is their parent, he's their father, and he basically gets off. And I mean, it's astonishing. No such thing as family loyalty, even to your own children. He's a despicable character. Yeah, and I think the snivellingness of him was caught brilliantly in the Tudors when he leaves the tower and he gets let out and both of his kids have been beheaded, and he just sort of scurries away like the rat that he is. Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And the Tudors, I mean, they get a hard press, that particular portrayal, that whole series. But you know, I kind of loved it. I'm sorry if it's a guilty pleasure, but I just think there was actually quite a lot that they got right. Okay, Henry didn't look right, and he never aged, and all of his wives looked like supermodels. But if you kind of get past that, I think they nailed quite a lot of the history. Yeah, you can see the use of the source material. You can also see where they thought, wow, that doesn't work, get rid of that. But you can also see it was annoying that they changed the name, you know, Margaret to Mary, and or the other way around. Or they just merged two sisters together, didn't they? Yeah. Yes. But it was fun. It's like, look, people can cope with the fact that there are a lot of Marys. You don't have to do that. You know? But the thing is, as well, it's just the fact that Henry Cavill's in it was enough for me. Oh, well. That's good for me. Yeah, absolutely. He did quite well, I think, doing the whole Duke of Suffolk not really embracing the Reformation. Yes. He did that quite well. But I thought he did that very well. But then it was kind of the last series when they were supposed to be old men, and they were talking like they were old men, and they were still in their 20s, and they'd sort of done a couple of grey streaks of hair and some padding to make Jonathan Rhys-Meyers look a bit fatter. But other than that, they really still looked like they were in their 20s. They did, and I'm afraid that's the major failing of it, and that's why it's been subject to ridicule, because nobody ever got any less good looking or any older. And it's such a shame, because, as I say, it takes away from the admirable aspects of that series.
I really enjoyed the girl who played Catherine Howard and how frivolous she really was. Yes. And absolutely, I really love that series. I mean, don't get me wrong, I sit on my own time period and criticise and yell at the TV all the time, but it made a complete change for me. It was great. I got to sit there and watch it, and actually, do you know what? That is what I'm going to watch tonight. So, and they quite accurately showed you that sort of Anne was set up, but that Catherine Howard actually, if any of his wives, was a bit of a slut. That was the culprit. Yeah. But what did you've already mentioned Hilary Mantel and the sense of humour, but what else did she nail? What were you reading in the trilogy where you just thought, yes, that's him, she's got him? So absolutely, his loyalty, his humour,
stand out before anything else. But I think as well, just the factual details, and I think particularly with the third novel, the various disparate threads that on their own wouldn't have been enough to bring him down, but she cleverly weaves them together so you can see how gradually his downfall unfolded. And I'm thinking particularly of his relationship with Princess Mary, or the Lady Mary, Henry's first eldest daughter. And with this, she quite rightly portrays their relationship. I think it's quite complex because, in theory, Mary should have hated Cromwell. He got rid of her mother, Catherine of Aragon, effectively by championing Anne Boleyn and the annulment. But in fact, Cromwell and she had this interesting relationship. They were almost allies, and so much so that it was rumoured that Cromwell was hoping to marry Mary. Now, of course, I think that was ridiculous, but that's a theme that Mantel definitely develops and weaves in, and you can see how this, and Mantel herself, clearly, she's portraying it as ridiculous, as a rumour, but she really gets across how rumour pretty much was enough in these days. Rumour was enough to bring down Anne Boleyn, and in the end it was enough to bring down Cromwell too.
What do you think of the portrayal of Jane Seymour? I liked her from the very beginning in Wolf Hall.
Yes.
Was she a good girl like that? Was she as I like as well the way she as soon as in Bring Up the Bodies, it becomes clear that sort of she's a queen in waiting. She starts to grow as a person. But I thought it was a fantastic portrayal.
I think it's a really good portrayal. I think a very believable one. We actually don't know much about Jane Seymour at all. She appears quite mild and placid. Just simply, she doesn't have much to say for herself, certainly in contrast to Anne Boleyn. But I liked her a lot in Wolf Hall. In real life, so to speak, I'm not so sure. I think she did absolutely stand a lot on ceremony. She was seen by some to be quite haughty and proud. She insisted that all due dignity was shown towards her, which I suppose, fair play. She was queen. But I think in Wolf Hall, Mantel draws her brilliantly, and you do like her naivety comes across, but also, she's not as stupid as she looks in Wolf Hall, is she?
No, I think as a novelist as well, what she was trying to do was highlight the absolute opposite ends of the spectrum occupied by Anne Boleyn, who is fully capable of speaking for herself and butting her head into things that Henry doesn't think she has any business in, and Jane, who was the antithesis of her almost.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Cromwell. Actually, in Wolf Hall, I think, I can't remember whose mouth these words are put into, but about Anne Boleyn being the vicious old hack, and Henry now has a nice new horse to ride, and that kind of contrast between Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour is drawn really, really well. I think in Wolf Hall, you have the kind of feisty wife who ends up just annoying Henry, and then the much more meek and mild on the surface Jane Seymour.
Thank you so much for talking to us about Wolf Hall. I could have this conversation all day. I could literally go through it page by page with you, but I suspect that even in lockdown, we've got better things to do. But it's brilliant. And I think she doesn't care. She doesn't know I exist. But congratulations due to Hilary Mantel for a fantastic trilogy.
Me too.
I mean, they're being touted as the best literature of the 21st century so far. I don't know if I agree insofar as Wolf Hall, but certainly as a trilogy and as a project and as a body of work, amazing.
And I think she deserves a third Booker Prize, in my opinion. I think it's amazing.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm now sold, and I will be reading this weekend. Thank you very much, ladies, for that. But Tracy, you've got a new book out this year, haven't you?
I've got a new novel out. So my own trilogy is about the years following the Gunpowder Plot. Well, the first one leads up to the Gunpowder Plot, and it's called the King's Witch Trilogy. But this third and final novel, which so far is still coming out in June, is called The Fallen Angel. And the sort of main character of the piece, and actually the main villain of the piece, is James I's great favourite, the Duke of Buckingham. So it was really fascinating, actually, just to leave the Tudors behind for a while and to explore the early Stuarts in this fiction trilogy. So that's out this June. But I think I need to end with something Tudor. And what I would like to end with, we've mentioned her quite a few times, that amazing lady, Anne Boleyn. And on the 19th of May, if all goes to plan, my new series on the downfall of Anne Boleyn will be broadcast. In the UK, it's on Channel 5. I'm not sure which other channels worldwide it will be available on yet, or whether you can view it online. I will certainly be tweeting details, but it's called The Fall of Anne Boleyn. And it looks at 3 critical days from her arrest to her execution. And it really gave me so many new insights. And I don't often say that about TV, but it was based on such painstaking research. And really, there was, for me, some complete revelations. So maybe we should have another chat about that sometime.
Definitely. If we're still in lockdown, on the 19th of May, will you come on and do, we will give that day to Anne Boleyn if you want to come on and talk about the downfall of Anne Boleyn.
Please, I would be delighted.
Yeah, but well done seeking out another historical gitbag and going for the Duke of Buckingham.
God, that is the way to describe him, absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure. It's been lovely talking to you both.
Cool. And I have no doubt we'll still be going on the 19th of May, because there's no end in sight. So we'll talk to you again then, and we will cover those 3 days in the life of Anne Boleyn and how it all grimly came to an end. I'll probably slag off her dad and her uncle quite a bit more.
Oh, let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it. That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Tracy.
Thank you.